Hello, everyone, and welcome to Poets Against Racism in This Together 2022. I'm Jo Shire, President of the Board of Directors for the Watershed Journal Literary Group in Brookville, Pennsylvania. I'm also a poet writing under the pen name Patricia Thrushhart, and in that capacity, I am a co-founder of Poets Against Racism USA. Both organizations are delighted to be co-sponsors of this reading along with our colleagues, Poets Against Racism in Nottingham, UK. Before I introduce our hosts to start the readings, I'd like to share a few thoughts. During this event being held on that solemn anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, we're going to hear works that explore issues of hate, bigotry, racism. These are tough topics, and the emotions they evoke can be challenging, even overwhelming. We ask that you be prepared for images that might upset you. And of course, we ask that you open your heart to the messages that our poets are bringing here tonight. We're fortunate to have three co-hosts taking us through tonight's readings, and I'd like to introduce them to you now. They'll be brought up here at the virtual podium in the order of their participation, but I wanted you to hear their bios. First of all, I'd like to introduce my co-founder of Poets Against Racism USA, Debbie Allen. She helped initiate this same event 1 year ago, and along with the Watershed Journal, where she serves on the board as secretary. She's a professional writer and editor, and while doing those activities, she encountered a passion for poetry, especially when working on literature programs in the field of educational publishing. She served as an associate poetry editor for the online journal Poets Reading the News, and much of her own poetry tends towards responses to injustice. Also joining us is Laura Gravel, representing Poets Against Racism in Nottingham. Laura is an immigrant, a performance poet, a fiction writer, and a blogger. She has performed her poetry far and wide, including in Texas and in Europe. She's a member of DIY Poets, in addition to Poets Against Racism in Nottingham, UK. Her eclectic poetry includes works tackling the immigrant experience, narratives, and character sketches. Laura's work has been published in podcasts, online zines, and anthologies, and her collaborative YouTube video, Girl Walking Across Europe, was created as an act of welcome for refugees. And finally, I'll introduce in advance our invited speaker and co-host, Professor Ursula Payne, a professor of dance at Slippery Rock University of Pennsylvania, where she has served as the university's Department of Dance chairperson and as artistic director of Slippery Rock University Dance Theater. Additionally, Professor Payne is director of the Frederick Douglass Institute at Slippery Rock and was appointed to serve as the university's diversity liaison officer to the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office. She completed a higher education management development program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and her research interests include higher educational leadership, dance studies, Black social and vernacular performance practices, womanist and Black feminist theory, pedagogy, and curriculum development. Before I turn this virtual platform over to Professor Payne, I'd like to read the first poem in our event tonight. It's by the poet Toy Derricotte, and it reminds us of how challenging this writing can be. It's titled, Why I Don't Write About George Floyd. Because there is too much to say, because I have nothing to say. Because I don't know what to say, because everything has been said, because it hurts too much to say. What can I say? What can I say? Something is stuck in my throat. Something is stuck like an apple. Something is stuck like a knife. Something is stuffed like a foot. Something is stuffed like a body. And now please welcome Professor Ursula Payne.
Good evening. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and for the poem. And I'm going to continue by reading my statement by Pearl Primus. My career has been a quest, a search for roots. The journey has taken me deep into the cultures of many people in many countries of the world. Dance has been my vehicle. Dance has been my language, my strength. In the dance, I have confided my most secret thoughts and shared the inner music of all mankind. I have danced across mountains and deserts, ancient rivers and oceans, and slipped through the boundaries of time and space. Dance has been my freedom, my world. It has enabled me to go around, scale, bore through, batter down, or ignore visible and invisible social and economic walls. Dance is my medicine. It is the scream which eases for a while the terrible frustrations common to all human beings who, because of race, creed, or color, are invisible. Dance is the fist with which I fight the sickening ignorance of prejudice. It is the veiled contempt I feel for those who patronize with false smiles, handouts, empty promises, insincere compliments. Instead of growing twisted like a gnarled tree inside myself, I am able to dance out my anger and my tears. Dance has been my teacher, ever patiently revealing to me the dignity, beauty, and strength in the cultural heritage of my people as a vital part of the great heritage of mankind. I dance not to entertain, but to help people better understand each other. Because through dance, I have experienced the wordless joy of freedom. I see it more fully for all people everywhere. This statement was published in the Black Theater Alliance newspaper in 1979. And Pearl Primus has been an inspiration to me. She was also a mentor, and she is one of our Black dance pioneers and also American modern dance pioneers who was instrumental in making works that really talked about the social ills that was happening with people, and particularly Black people. I am a dancer, an artist, a choreographer, and movement specialist. Dance is how I describe my artistic practice, and movement is how I come to interact within, explore, and understand the world around me. The intersections of body, movement, and language saturate my professional, personal, and social existence. As an observer of movement, I'm curious about what people reveal about themselves through their physical expression and mood fluctuations. Movement can register as a subtle relational gesture or shift in eye focus that invites you in or cusses you out, or manifest in the tensing up of the musculature of the jaw, forming a smile, or the crumpling of an eyebrow, indicating discomfort. The body speaks and exerts an intensity of presence. As I encounter the presence of your body, I see and receive movement cues from the quality of your expression that indicates a range of emotions and psychological states, like kindness, hesitancy, anger, happiness, danger, support, fear, or sadness. I find myself thinking more about the power of energy transference. I try to be intentional in my movement choices when interacting with others inside the dance studio or within the quotidian activities of daily life. In A Black Gaze, Artists Changing How We See, author Tina M. Camp describes the concept of spectactorial meditation, which she claims demands active modes of watching, listening, and witnessing. I offer this as a way forward towards a deeper experience of allyship or solidarity that can stretch across cultures and social situations. As we engage in quotidian choreographies tonight, I also lean on dance scholar Ursula, who asks us to consider that we are embodied beings. She inspires me to consider the sensual transactional nature of the lived experience from the perspective of moving bodies. To Dr. Akinyele, embodiment is a reminder of relational transactions and that we are all connected. Her assertion of, quote, our lives are in movement can stand as another way forward, leading towards a deeper engagement with each other that can create support and healing and reconciliation across race, class, and gender. Bodies grounded in movement and in motion tell stories. Stories reveal personal and interpersonal narratives of interaction with animate and inanimate objects. Rhythmic environments and improvisational activity inform how we move in relationship to others. This liminal space becomes the currency that permeates our interactions, our connections, communications, and exchanges with others. In this way, we become sensorial witnesses to each other, engaging in ranges of transactional behaviors existing between continuums of allyship on one end and progressing towards extreme violence on the other. Within the dynamic intensity of the space, I endeavor to see through and above the evil forces of anti-Blackness and white supremacy that converge to generate ontological terrors that threaten all of us. Here again, I turn to engage a conversation between dance scholars. Vivek A. Clark's conception of the body as a repository of information, cultural, relational, and historical, intertwines with Catherine McKittrick's notion that the body transforms into a geographic site of knowledge. McKittrick's definition of geographic arises out of assembling new social, political, and creative relations in three-dimensional spaces and places. So I humbly reflect on the memory of seeing George Floyd's brutal murder in the street and hearing about the live streaming of 10 courageous souls who were gunned down while grocery shopping in Buffalo. And as of yesterday, I mourn the loss of 19 children, 2 teachers who were mercilessly gunned down in Texas. These recent tragedies have occurred against a backdrop of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Numerous casualties, destroyed environments, and refugees have emerged from this war. In this present moment, our individual and collective bodies are responding to these horrors. I pause for a moment to breathe, inhale and exhale, scream and shake in my chair. African American studies scholar Calvin L. Warren suggests that ontological terror as being a condition of every Black life, but not the total of Black existence. In this contemporary moment, I will expand this to include every life. All of us as embodied beings understand the murder of these human beings as arising out of hatred, fueled by centuries of Black, Brown, and Native American death. Anti-Blackness, anti-Native American, anti-Asian, anti-immigrant, anti-trans, anti-woman, anti-fill in the blank. We have become sensorial witnesses to multiple transactional behaviors of violence. We post, record, and create to intervene and to generate ad hoc healing processes and calls for change in our communities. But how do we continue to challenge ourselves to resist being stuck in the deep and dirty muck of racism and terror, even as we face ongoing senseless violence? As we collectively grieve the lives lost throughout the world, I draw upon the deep spiritual understandings that this is not the end of existence. As sensorial witnesses and embodied beings moving towards allyship, I see remembering past struggles as a way forward. Historically racialized bodies have performed boldly as intergenerational repositories of diasporic memory and as disruptive agents. I break 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. As a descendant of enslaved African Americans brought to North Carolina by way of Ghana and Angola, the diasporic memory of their bodies conjures the trauma of the transatlantic slave trade, where individualistic and expressionistic movement changed as newly enslaved African people were forced to dance and move about to maintain their physical health and agility under extreme duress and torture on slave ships. Whips were used to sustain violence, terror, and rape, which shifted traditional African dancing into modes of movement expressions that embodied attitudes of urgency, survival, spiritual activism, and resistance. When thinking about the kinetic, oral, and spiritual shifts in Black movement traditions from this perspective, the intergenerational transfer of movement exchanges from body to body further signifies the Black body in particular as a site of cultural memory for the Black community. Furthermore, it was in this context of the transatlantic slave trade that mobility's encoded messages carried by enslaved Black bodies as technology from one plantation to another, and through the great migrations from south to north, seeded the development of the American dance literary and theatrical traditions. So out of the past and present terrors, we witness how Black bodies emerge as a weapon, an intergenerational multiplicative vessel of communication between the African pre-colonial body, the Black Atlantic body, and then to the diversity of contemporary bodies. Our collective embodied interactions as allies amplifies dynamic communal exchanges and activism against police brutality, gendered and racial violence, racism in all its forms, and poverty. In this way, we become the architects of resilience, resistance, love, sanctity, and spirituality. I contemplate how each of us will be called to lay ourselves and our bodies on the line for the benefit of the community, and to generate shared social and cultural processes of healing, reconciliation, and transcendence. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Laura Gravel, and it's wonderful to be here tonight. Thank you so much for this powerful start, Joe and Professor Payne. I'm here representing Poets Against Racism, Nottingham, UK, and it is extra special for me to be here because I'm connecting my country of origin, the United States, with the United Kingdom, which where I've lived for 13 years. And to be able to bring two wonderful poets with me, and that is Ambrose and Cara, whom I will introduce later. Tonight, I'm going to contribute a poem, and this was inspired during the Black Lives Matter protests when I started looking back at my life and re-examining certain events. It's called 1980 Juneteenth Rising. I'm walking down this hot street. I'm holding a baby walking down this hot street. I don't know why I'm doing this yet. I'm thinking I'm just doing my job. I'm a park leader, a skinny white girl on this second ever Juneteenth parade in Austin, Texas, celebrating the day the slaves heard they were free. I mean, I know why we're doing it. I work at a park, two parks. One, all the kids are Black, one is mixed race. But it hasn't really dawned that the heat of this march is not just the sweat of my arms, the sweat of this child who is Black, not just our sweat sliding over each other, intermingling and dropping, sizzling on the brutal street as the drums come solemn behind us. It hasn't even dawned that the need of this child is not just that this child's mother is at work, not just that this child is a defenseless infant, as the drums come solemn, as the drums come solemn, come solemn. We're marching down this hot street, a gaggle of kids between three park leaders, all squinting into the sun. Almost nobody watching from the sidelines, 'cause this ain't Congress Avenue. This street is a backside to ugliness between the Villa Capri Motel parking lot and the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library parking lot, on a street radiating heat, cooking us like stew. But we march on, this baby and I. And we made it, sister. You never complained. At 9 months, you knew. It's taken me 59 years. Today, I'm marching down this hot street. I'm marching down this hot street with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that wonderful poem. And thank you, Joe, for starting us off, and Professor Payne for your incredible presentation. I took some notes during, and I just want to point out one thing I thought was really interesting that Professor Payne said was, she talked about the power of bodies in motion with one another. And it made me think that maybe poetry is kind of like the intellectual movement of bodies together. So I just thought that was an interesting correlation that I made or could make there. So I'm Debbie Allen, and someone had suggested that I talk briefly about how this event came about. So I'll begin by doing that. Last April, I was online searching for resources for poets who want to use their craft to fight racism. And what I found was Poets Against Racism based in Nottingham, UK. And so I contacted Manjit Sahota, the co-founder of Poets Against Racism, and said, I'd like to do a Poets Against Racism event in the United States on the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. And he thought about it for about 1 second and said, let's do it. And that was awesome. And so then I contacted the people at the Watershed Journal, and they were equally enthusiastic. And so last year we put on our inaugural In This Together event. And it was, the recording of it took place on, or was shown on different platforms, and overall we got hundreds of views of the recording of it. So that made me feel really good about the idea that we were reaching people, and I hope that the same will happen this year. So Manjit continues to provide support and encouragement to us, and then as a result of the event that took place last year, Patricia and I put our heads together and devised the idea of forming Poets Against Racism USA, and again had Manjit's full backing for that. And so we launched that about 6 months ago. And like I said, Manjit's been wonderful. And I don't even have words to express what a tremendous partner Patricia is in this endeavor. And not only is she a great partner to me in this, but she's also a talented and prolific poet. And so I do want to talk briefly about her poetry. She has published 4 books of poems. The most recent one was Inspired by Their Voices, Poetry from Underground Railroad Testimonies, which is a really poignant book of poetry. Her poems have appeared in numerous literary magazines such as Tiny Seed, Woodcat, Still Point Arts Quarterly, Feminine Collective, Curating Alexandria, High Shelf Press, and Muddy River. I just want to say it's just an honor and inspiration to work so closely with Patricia on a regular basis. So thanks to her. Now I'm going to give a little bit of background about the poem I'm going to read tonight that I've written. Because of some personal experience that happened recently, I've been researching the poem Strange Fruit, which was written by Abel Meeropol. And Abel Meeropol was a white Jewish teacher in New York City who wrote Strange Fruit in response to the lynchings that were happening around the United States in that time, which was the 1930s. He set the poem to music and performed it as a protest against the horrors of racism. And then, of course, the poem was made famous when Billie Holiday performed and recorded her incredible rendition of it, the song. And so the first thing I want to say about that is I always like to point out that, you know, when Meeropol wrote those words, he was channeling his outrage. They were shocking to people, and they had an impact. And that's what I want to say is that I always like to point out that poetry can have an impact, you know, that it can reach people in ways that other things can't. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to say is that when things happen like what happened in Buffalo, for me, at least, you almost can't help but feel that same outrage that Meeropol felt about the idea that people are being murdered because of the color of their skin. And this time I took my latest round of outrage and formed it into a poem that was inspired by Meeropol's work, and I would like to read that right now. Strange Fruit Still, after Abel Meeropol. Soundless, unseen mobs bear gore, blood in the pew and blood on the door. Black bodies heaped on pitted tile, strange fruit strewn in a grocery aisle. Commonplace calm, breath's innocence, shattered, shuttered by circumstance. A smile of friendship, a child at play, then sudden the sound of bullet spray. Here is fruit strange only when dropped, only when blighted by what must be stopped, only produced by seeds of hate. Here is a yield we can't tolerate. So That's my poem. And now I'd like to introduce our first featured poem of the evening, which is Wayne Swanger. And Wayne is representing the Watershed Journal Literary Group here tonight, but I'm happy to say and proud to say that he's also a member of Poets Against Racism USA. And I just want to give a little bit about Wayne's background as he comes on board here. Wayne is retired from higher education and lives in northwestern Pennsylvania. As a doctoral student, he was a graduate assistant in Penn State's special education master's and doctoral programs. He later served as advisor for the Native American Student Association at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. And while there, he initiated collaboration between the university and College of the Menominee Nation. And in fact, one of the poems that Wayne is going to read tonight relates to that background and also to the kind of newish revelations about how Native American children were treated historically in the United States. And Wayne has always, been concerned about social justice. So he also served as advisor for the Clarion University chapter of the NAACP. Wayne and his wife, Mary, are long-distance grandparents of Emile Wallace Swanger, their sunshine. So welcome, Wayne.
Thank you, Deb. It's an honor to participate in tonight's Poets Against Racism event in this Together 2022. Greetings to all the participants in tonight's program. It's indeed a privilege and honor to be in this together with all of you. Welcome to all who are viewing the program live and those who will take an opportunity to view the recorded version that will be posted on Poets Against Racism USA. I'm going to read two poems. The first poem that I will share with you tonight was written relatively recently. It was inspired in part by the fact that we are a biracial family. We're blessed to have a 4-year-old grandson, Emile, who will be starting preschool this coming school year. And in part, it was inspired by a classroom observation a number of years ago, an observation of a rather unstructured lesson filled with movement, noise, and student interactions. An observation where I noted that the one student reprimanded, and repeatedly so, was the only student of color in the group. This poem is entitled To a Grandson. To a grandson. Do not allow it to consume your light. Do not allow it. At first, a glance, a tone of voice, a stranger's coldness nibbles at your brown lightness. Barely noticed, but like a mouse at night, it leaves a dropping or two in your consciousness to note its passing. Do not allow it to consume your light. Do not allow it. In the din of a classroom, it will be you that is too loud, who lacks self-control, whose laughter and joy is considered lack of seriousness. Others pause in their bustle and take note that you are the one reprimanded. Soon you pause when once you did not hesitate. Your smile doubt faded. Do not allow it to consume your light. Do not allow it. A girl's whisper sniggers on the playground, questions about your hair, your full lips, mocking laughter, unfamiliar words evoke a sense of shame, provoke anger, evolving into rage. You cry and try to hide. Do not allow it to consume your light. Do not allow it. Relentless, it tries to pull you toward its dark, malevolent wasteland, irrepressible, a black hole striving to swallow your light, devour your being, adding you to its countless conquered victims. Do not allow it to consume your light. Do not allow it. Your light within, your precious light, stoke it in the stillness. Seek that source of luminescence that dispels darkness. Gradually inflame your inner light, its incandescence flaring up when most needed, until your light blazes, a supernova. The second poem that I'll share with you tonight is entitled Lessons at Carlisle Indian Industrial School, 1879 to 1918. Carlisle Indian Industrial School is located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, a small town near where I grew up. The horrors of this residential institution and many like it are slowly being exposed today. This poem was inspired by a photo in an article in the Carlisle Sentinel marking the centennial of the institution's closing. The photo was a Native American student sitting at his desk. Lessons at Carlisle Indian Industrial School, 1879 to 1918. Lesson 1. Oblivious, Little Bear sat, a front row seat, dead center, while Blackrobe wielded his chalkstone like a saber, slashing violently letters on the slate. Many flinched, the youngest cried. Little Bear sat stone-faced, no different than he looks in this old photograph. Lesson 2. Oblivious to Little Bear, Blackrobe wielded his chalkstone like a knife, cruelly carving words on the slate, letters white, exact, uniform, exemplars for the unsaved mourners with shorn heads and leather-shod feet. Bounce, pounce, trounce. Look, rhyming words, do you hear the music of your new language? Say them. Little Bear remained mute, preferring the music of the old Lakota, Dakota, Nakota. He chanted this music deep within so Blackrobe would not beat a steady rhythm on his back. Once again. Lesson 3. Oblivious to Little Bear, Blackrobe pulled his chalkstone from his pocket like a gun and banged on the slate. These rhyming words are verbs, action words. Read them. Bounce, pounce, trounce. Little Bear did not read. He knew these things. Coyote, Big Cat, and Fox had taught him just as Sitting Bull had shown Yellow Hair and his soldiers at Little Bighorn. Lesson 4. Oblivious to Little Bear, Blackrobe became a soldier of a different sort. His weapons were scissors, leather boots, textbooks, discipline, and education. He sought to kill the Indian and save the man. The tally: 158 graduates, 180 graves. The killing was easy, the saving less so. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne, so much for poetry. I just want to talk a little bit about both of Wayne's poems. The first one is To a Grandson. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little feedback. I don't know if the other speakers might want to mute if they haven't. Okay, anyway, so that's good. So the first poem, To a Grandson, what I thought was really, there was a lot going on in that poem, obviously, but one of the things that kind of struck me was the way Wayne handled the concept of racism. He really debased it by referring to it as it throughout the poem. And at the same time, though, he illustrated the realities of racism by providing really concrete details about acts of racism and, more important, even their effects. And one of the things that I noticed was that a lot of the acts of racism mentioned in the poem are microaggressions and instances of ingrained biases. And I think it's really important to talk about these things because I think it's things that people who are in non-marginalized groups often don't comprehend, sometimes dismiss. And so I was really, I think, looking at those details in Wayne's poem can help all of us understand more about what people go through that we may not even think about. And then his second poem, The Carlisle Indian School, there are a couple things I thought about that poem. One, obviously, it brings awareness to a type of systemic racism that has not gained as much attention as some other types. And so I really appreciated that in that poem. And then secondly, it also reveals the brutality of forced acculturation. And, like just some of the wording, the figurative language about the teachers slashing violently and cruelly carving words on the slate underscores the aggression behind that process of making people be what you want them to be. And then I also appreciated that Wayne used the character of Little Bear to emphasize how strongly people desire to hold on to their cultural backgrounds. And I think that for people who are, under the impression that people should just assimilate, or we don't need to celebrate certain, cultural holidays and so forth, I think they need to put themselves in the place of those people who are being asked to give up their cultural background and think about what would they want to do. No, of course they would want to hang on to their customs and their traditions and their celebrations and their ways of life. And so I just appreciate Wayne's two poems for those reasons. And I'll now turn things over to my co-host. Ursula, do you want to respond to Wayne's poetry?
Yes, thank you. And I will start with To a Grandson. With this particular poem, I was really brought into the speaker's voice, and it almost like it was a whisper to the grandchild, something that you might, I could imagine the child sleeping and then the grandfather going in and kind of speaking these things into the grandchild's spirit. So I felt like I was really taken to that place of prayers at night. And also tapped into my memory of how my mother used to anoint my head with oil as a child for protection and favor as I was going kind of throughout my day. And so I connected with the idea of thinking about subtle racism or microaggressions, as Debbie also mentioned. And the connection of microaggressions, I thought, with mouse droppings, I thought was really clever. And the idea that, like, you don't notice it at first, but there are things that really seep into your consciousness. I also feel like there are nuggets of warnings, like warning signs that are kind of strategically positioned throughout the poem. And it reminds me of code switching, right? Code switching as a strategy for survival. And so what happens to one's ability to become immune to judgments? And then coming back to this idea, I really love the repetition of the three lines of "do not allow it to consume your light, do not allow it." It invites a certain rhythm into the poem, which also I think has that sense of a mantra, something that you keep kind of repeating to yourself over and over. I also thought the use of language was really effective in speaking urgently about double standards. Also, it brought up ideas of racialized surveillance that can occur in schools that lead to over-policing of Black and brown bodies. And so again, that I think is a connection to that institutional racism. As I shift to the first poem, Lessons at Carlisle Indian Industrial School, the imagery of this I felt was so powerful. And I also thought the images conjured movement, like motion. And so the idea of slashing and of, it had intensity in terms of time and strength and weight. And, but also, again, that sense of violence. And I also felt the interaction between kind of the different characters. And so the response, the visceral response to the environment, the visceral responses to how this kind of assimilation processes were occurring in a way that kind of built from the first lesson to the fourth lesson. I'm also left thinking about the images of the graves at the end, and the attempts to annihilate Native American culture, and the fact that the will of the little bear, the stoicness and also the stillness of this particular character, the resolve to hold on to the lessons passed on through generations.
Thanks. Laura?
Okay, thank you. Those are all really good points. And what I could add, I think, is that I was struck by the many strengths of these two poems. And one similar thing about them both was that the architecture, they're so artfully and concisely constructed, very carefully, but elegantly. You don't notice it as sticking out like a foot or something. It's very elegantly done, and this builds both poems in intensity, starting with the simplicity to a grandson. Do not allow it to consume your life. Do not allow it. And as Professor Payne said, that comes again and again, which helps with the building. And then in the lessons, we have the lesson, and then oblivious little bear. And again, the black robe is oblivious, really, to who and what little bear is. And these techniques, which don't stick out at all, add to this great strength and foundation of both of these poems. And the repetition, bounce, pounce, trounce, becomes very, very powerful also in the lessons. And these simple images in the lessons are so stark. And then the gradual movement into a grandson, while it goes towards a lightness at the end, the other goes to graves. And both of them have incredibly strong endings too, with this, your inner light, its incandescence flaring up when most needed until your light blazes a supernova. And so you're really taking off the listener or reader with that as a supernova. And then the other, where the graves, the killing was easy, the saving less so. So that's what I'll say, as I think most other things have been said.
Well, thank you to both of you. I appreciate your input. Now I'm going to introduce our next poet, who's representing Poets Against Racism USA, and that is Gerard Turnasol. Gerard has published the 2-volume book series Psalms of Fern, and his poetry has appeared in numerous literary magazines, including the Watershed Journal, the Bridge Literary Arts Journal, Clarion University's Tabiko, Rune, Adelaide Literary Journal, Pennsylvania Poetry Society's Penessence, and Poets' Choice Awards. His works also have been published online in the Indiana Gazette and on North-South Appalachia. And his next project is a fusion of poetry, memoir, and fiction, inspired by growing up in a Northern Appalachia small town. So Gerard, can you, down at the bottom, turn your video on for us? There you go. Thank you and welcome. And I'm looking forward to hearing your
Thank you, Debbie. I appreciate it. It's a great honor to be here with everyone tonight, and thank you to Poets Against Racism. It's an amazing organization, and it's an important organization. And thank you to our UK partners and the poets that have read also. Where to begin? Before there was George, as we're commemorating this evening, I became aware of this issue in 2015 through a person named Walter Scott, a young man who was buying a car in Baltimore. The car he was driving had a tail light. As he was test driving, there were no traffic violations. He was pulled over for a tail light in a used car that he was thinking about buying. Now, all experiences in life are self-referential. So a shared experience with another person is seen through the lens or the optics of your own experience. So up until this time, I want to tell you that for many years of my life, I had a problem with speeding in my car. I don't know. I was in a hurry to go somewhere. And I get a lot of traffic tickets. I drove all over the United States. I was stopped by police officers of every race and creed. And it's not a comfortable experience, but I had an idea of how that went. So I'd vaguely heard that there may be a difference between races with traffic stops. So self-referentially, I saw that through my own eyes. I'm like, yeah, sure, it's uncomfortable. And when I saw this event in Baltimore in 2015, and again, George Floyd is not an isolated incident. It's another data point in a long series going back hundreds of years, as Ursula had said, of incidents. And things like this happen, and different people like myself and others come to this realization of our eyes being opened, and the term of enlightenment or revelation or awakening is definitely applicable, because when I saw the traffic stop through the policeman's camera happen normally, and then cut to a playground where a young, brave man, I imagine, was holding his cell phone camera in his pocket like this. I don't know if you can see that or not. And he videotaped an episode that shocked the living daylights out of me. I just couldn't believe what I saw. It was a murder. Absolutely. There was no question about it. The cold-bloodedness of it shook me to my core, and I'll never forget that moment. And it inspired me to write this poem I'm about to read. As I turned, I woke. I'd heard about problems with the police. Hard to hear, harder to believe. Personally, I never had a problem. Oh, a few well-deserved speeding tickets, probably got a break. No, definitely. I drove very fast, especially in the turns. Roll the tires fast in the turns. That was me. And the more I heard, the faster I turned. As a young kid, I applied and was accepted to 6 colleges. 6 for 6, piece of cake. Why the stress? My SAT score equated to an IQ of 1, above plant life. Accepted open arms. Those wasps loved me. Graduate school, 1 for 1, best in the country, bar none. MBA with honors. That was easy. They called it the golden passport. Yes, passports are even faster. I never had a problem with Band-Aids, the bank, the insurance company, the healthcare system. Never turned down for a credit card, car loan, life insurance policy, or a request for a specialist. Experience is the best teacher, and the more I learned, the less I wanted to know, and the faster I turned. Then I learned about certain specifics, certain policies with regard to traffic stops, bank loans, rental property, healthcare, voting rights, marriage. I read The Color Purple, and then that invaluable government syphilis experiment that would have been inconceivable even to Dr. Mengele. That the Star-Spangled Banner has more than one stanza. Really? There's 4 stanzas? My country, 'tis of me, and it was making me feel dirty. Learned that no one voluntarily held that flag up that hellish night, or ramparts we watched, as slave and freed men were ordered to their near certain death with the threat of absolute certain death. Then I watched a cop shoot a kid in the back in cold blood near a merry-go-round on a playground in Baltimore, Maryland. I liked Baltimore. Fast, very fast, he emptied the 10-round clip of a semi-automatic 9mm Glock 27 into that kid's back. No hesitation, murder. Baltimore, 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 Baltimore. I hit the brakes hard on those fast decades and decades. Generations, generations, generations of turning. I slowed down, way, way, way down, stopped, took a deeper breath. Then I did what I always did and I do best. I turned. I turned around. And as I turned, I awoke to kneel. This next poem I'm about to read came a number of years later. Men have this secret admiration society for each other. And the more I learned about the late Representative John Lewis, the more I admired him. And when he passed away, I did a little more research into his life and found that early in his youth, he had the very radical idea of protesting for, those crazy things like voting rights and civil rights. And him and his buddies would drive around and they called each other the Freedom Riders. And they'd go to these protests for voting rights and civil rights. Sounds so crazy, radical, right? And he took pride in the fact that as a diminutive man, almost everywhere he went to these protests, he got the crap beat out of him. And the one he remembered the most was an incident on a bridge where he was beaten to within an inch of his life. And as he was losing consciousness, he didn't know if he was going to wake up. And that man took that inspiration his whole life. You could see it on his face. And I wrote this poem in honor of John Lewis. It's called That Bridge. He lay beaten on that bridge, freedom, an inch away from his life. This is the bloody reality of turning the other cheek over and over again, as taught on Sundays, where lessons on meekness are served with tongues of flowing robes, clapping hands, and a truth that your best friend could hand you over to the empire for a few bucks because he thinks you're dumb for telling folks that they're more than the empire says they are, more than they themselves can yet believe, more than that bridge. Thank you so much for your time this evening and letting me read to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. I'm going to start with Gerard's second poem, That Bridge, because I have not a lot to say about that. But what I want to say about it is that poem makes me sad because, it's like it points out the fact that it takes a tragedy to get people to pay attention to something. And then they only pay attention for such a short time that often nothing happens. And then when things do happen, like, people did pay attention to what happened on that bridge. There was a Voting Rights Act passed, but where are we now? We're going backward, and the right to vote is once again threatened. So that poem just makes me sad because it makes me think about all the times that something horrible happens, like has happened recently, and nothing changes. Gerard's first poem, I do want to say a little bit more about. I know we're running a little short on time. We're about an hour in, so just to keep everyone aware. But I wanted to say quickly that what I think is the power of that poem, As I Turned, I Woke, is its honesty. As poets, we write what we know, just like other writers. And as white poets, it can be hard to write and share poetry about our unwoke pasts. It can be painful, but I think what we all completely understand is that it's not nearly as painful as the hurt of racism. And so those among us who are the most courageous, like Gerard was in writing that poem, they put everything out there. They tell the truth, and I think that's important. Honestly, it's I've tried it, and it's hard, and so I just want to commend him for that. And I also want to say that the last thing I'll say about that poem is I like Gerard's description of his evolution, and his discussion of the things that many of us don't know about. We're just not made aware of things. It's just not in our sphere of awareness. And so, we don't think about it, and we're not taught things. Even today, we know what's not being taught in the schools. But certainly when I was in school, I did not learn that the person who wrote our national anthem was a slaveholder and a defender of slavery, as Gerard mentions and references in his poem. And so I think the poem I hope it can kind of inspire people to question the accuracy of their knowledge bank and search out facts that haven't been made available to them. And then, have an open mind about changing their perspectives on events and issues and so forth. So I appreciate Gerard's 2 poems for those reasons. And now I'll turn it over to Laura.
Thank you, Debbie. Those were very good points. And I'll start with As I Turned, I Woke. I saw it as a poem of realization, and it covers a lot of ground in a life to arrive at the truths. And I'm glad, I think a lot of people have gone through that. And with the Black Lives Matter protests, I hope people have done that, because my mind started to race. I saw these images and the unbelievable police combat response to people who were just peacefully marching, that I just, I was just absolutely shocked and horrified. And this poem ends with the outrage at what's been going on, and that the person is realizing all this, and with history, the color purple, the syphilis, the Star Spangled Banner, and all these references are really wonderful and build to this awful image and to, unfortunately, things that we have seen all too often and heard about more. We hear more about it in the last years. And then that bridge is an incredibly concise and powerful poem. And like you said, the point, this man was beaten in 1965, and you read this, and it's a beautiful piece. And I researched just a little bit on John Lewis. And when that happened, and that was broadcast, when that happened in Selma, Alabama, people were watching at the time a news program called Judgment at Nuremberg. And this was the culpability of those who participated in the Holocaust. And it was that juxtaposition that people realized, oh my, these people are just as guilty as those people were at the Holocaust. And I found that fascinating, that it took that for people to notice that it was wrong. And then the thing this also brings out for me, and I think part of the poem point, is that what has changed? People are still being beaten on bridges. And so very powerful work, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Laura and Debbie, for your comments. I'll start with As I Turned, I Woke. And what really grabbed me was the opening sentence. I felt it really powerfully set the frame for how the poem then progressed. And the opening and the ending, and this is something that we talk so much about in composition and in choreography, like having a strong opening and having a strong ending in terms of the image that you want to leave the viewer or the audience person with. And I felt like the images that were set up at the beginning and at the end were really strong and resonate in my mind. I felt that this poem situated me in a space where I was thinking about one's life journey, and how they are reflecting back on that journey, reflecting about knowledge, educational success, just how one is moving kind of in a normal way through life, but then they become confronted by their own realization of white privilege. And I thought the way that the poet kind of created that or choreographed the language, right, to help us arrive and to see that occur, I thought was really powerful. I felt that this was also about loss of innocence, kind of loss of that way of moving through the world kind of without thinking about these things. And that's something that kind of seeing this murder, seeing this, the murder of this child being killed, it made me think about death. Of course, Black death, and also the annihilation of Black bodies. And again, it sets up these tensions that I think when I also read the second poem of that bridge, one of the tensions in this particular poem for me that stands out is the price of nonviolence, right? Nonviolence and nonviolence as a strategy for protest. Is it really working? And kind of questioning that. And so if I look at both of these poems kind of together, kind of in the form of a duet, the way that they are kind of positioned with each other, I think really reveals that tension that still exists today. We're still asking ourselves these questions, about nonviolent with Martin Luther King or Malcolm X type of militancy and fighting back.
Thank you. Now, Laura, I'm going to turn things over to you to introduce the next poet.
Yes, it's my privilege to introduce the poet Ambrose Musiyiwa, who is one of our featured poets for Poets Against Racism UK in Nottingham. Ambrose is a poet and journalist. He coordinates Journeys in Translation, an international volunteer-driven initiative that is translating into other languages the book Overland, Oversea, Poems for Those Seeking Refuge. Books he has edited include Bollocks to Brexit, an anthology of poems and short fiction, Black Lives Matter, Poems for a New World, and Poetry and Settled Status for All, an anthology. Tonight, Ambrose will share poems from Overland, Oversea, and Poetry and Settled Status for All. And here I'll turn over to Ambrose.
Thank you for the introduction, Laura. So as I'm attending this event today, there are a number of things that are on my mind. I'm thinking of the students, African students, and also Indian students and other students of color who were studying in Ukraine and were prevented from leaving the country, were told that they couldn't get on buses, they couldn't get on trains. And when they eventually managed to find their way to the borders, to countries bordering Ukraine, they were forced to stand in queues in the snow for days while their Ukrainian counterparts their Ukrainian counterparts exit from Ukraine were expedited. I'm also thinking of the reception that the students are receiving in Europe, where their Ukrainian counterparts are given 3 years, 2 years visas or residence permits, while the black and brown counterparts are given shorter stays. I'm also thinking of the people who are still dying in the Mediterranean as they flee war zones. I'm also thinking of people who are dying in the agency as they also flee conflicts. The poems that I'm going to read tonight are also inspired by this reflection on on migration, forced migration. The first one is called Journeying, and it goes like this. Journeying, we threw things that were heavy overboard. They sank. We stayed afloat. We lived. They turned into creatures of the sea and stayed below the surface. When we reached dry land, they turned into creatures of shadow and followed us everywhere. The second poem that I'm going to read is called Martians Effing Martians. The poem is a reflection of a policy that former Prime Minister Theresa May instituted in the UK, which was designed to make life as difficult as possible for immigrants. The policy is having a devastating effect on people, on black and brown people in the UK, irrespective of their immigration status. And also, incidentally, today is the 10th anniversary of that policy. Martians, effing Martians. Okay, so before I start, when I say Martians, I'm not saying machines. I'm talking about the people from the planet Mars. So that this is like a word check. So when I say Martians, I'm not talking about machines. I'm talking about Martians. Them that live on Mars. And I will start by inviting you to imagine that there are Martians living among us. I'll also go further and ask you to imagine that actually there might be Martians on this platform with us tonight, sharing poems or listening to poems. This poem is about them. Martians effing Martians. Shall we blame Martians for everything that is wrong with the world? Shall we scan every building, every meeting, living, breathing space for signs of Martians? Shall we prod Earthlings, ask them to be on guard, and report, round up, or bash any Martian sighted or imagined? Shall we bring out spaceships and start patrolling the streets? Shall we fit PA systems to the spaceships and play messages on a loop, telling Martians to go back home, that if they do not leave voluntarily, we will come for them and forcibly remove them? Shall we round up all Martians, put them in detention centers, put them on the next spaceship to Mars? Shall we gas them? Shall we nuke them? Thank you very much. And also, just to be clear, and also so that there's no confusion, I am not for 1 second advocating violence towards or against Martians. I think Martians are pretty cool. The poem is a reflection on the violence and the hostility that governments engineer towards groups that they designate as not belonging. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambrose. I'm jumping in here in place of Laura, who was supposed to go first, to let people know that we only have 15 minutes left. And I'm thinking that I'd like to have Laura come on and introduce Cara, our final poet, and let Cara read her poems. And then the three panelists can come back on afterwards and talk about Ambrose and Cara's poetry if time allows. But I certainly want us all to be able to hear Cara's poetry. So Sarah, if you could have Laura come on and introduce Cara. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Hello. I'm proud to be able to introduce Cara Thompson, featured poet also for Poets Against Racism, Nottingham, UK. Cara is a poet, activist, and self-described Black wellness warrior from Nottingham. Her works celebrate her Caribbean heritage and explore links between mental health and social justice. Her writing has been commissioned and featured by organizations such as the NHS Leadership Academy, HuffPost Black Voices, and Oxfam International in 2021. In 2021, Cara won the UNESCO Cities of Literature's International Slam Poetry Competition, Slam-O-Vision, with her fantastic poem, Island Screams, Where Are You From?, which is one of the poems we will get to hear tonight. Cara.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for having me, Poets Against Racism. It's great to be here and to share this space with you all. Like it was mentioned at the beginning, this is a heavy subject matter, but like the title says, when you're in it together, it does kind of help us bear the weight. So the first poem that I'm going to be reading today is a poem called My Activism. For a bit of background, before I considered myself a poet, I considered myself an activist. So when I was 15, off the back of the killing of Michael Brown, I joined the first UK chapter of Black Lives Matter, which was started in Nottingham also. Nottingham has a real deep history of activism, actually, I feel like I should say. We were one of the first cities to really kick off with riots in the 50s when it came to kind of racial injustice. So we have a real legacy of that kind of work. But getting back to the point, I started off as an activist in that group. And while I'm no longer an active part of the group, I definitely took a lot from that time. And my ideas of what activism means have really evolved. Activism is the traditional things we think of. It's marching, it's speaking, it's protesting, but it can also be resting. It can also be creating. And so that's what this is about. And I hope it leaves everyone with something that they can take away and take with them as an act today. My activism. My activism is as quiet as firing neurons and as loud as falling statues. It creeps up on you silently, scrawls love notes on your walls, and crawls inside your ballot boxes. My activism is skeptical. Its nose twitches at lip service. It itches, burns beneath the friction of scrolling fingers and Judas kisses. My activism is supple, malleable, like clay. It's eager to take shape in the deep cracks of weathered hands and to cure with the sands of wisdom and time. My activism is ancestral. It's written in the lines of my heel and my double helix. It traverses through time, straddling a battalion of broad-shouldered women who birthed dark armies and rained fire from the mountaintops. My activism is bottomless. Its waters run deep. It invites you to drink, to savor, to blink against the shadows and lock eyes across the darkness. And my activism is its arms stretch like elastic to find you. It reminds you to pull against the status quo, until something finally snaps. Thank you. So my next poem is going to be the poem that Laura very kindly introduced, called Island Screams. This poem's really special to me. It's one of those poems that just came. I think I wrote it in about half an hour, and it's the culmination of I think years of something that I've been wanting to say. And the kind of general premise of this poem is that I'm responding to the question, where are you from? So for those that don't know, a large kind of percentage of the Black population in the UK came from the Caribbean. So I'm descended from Jamaicans, very proudly. I love my Jamaican heritage. And the Jamaicans and other Caribbeans that came to the UK are called the Windrush generation, kind of because the boat that they came over on was called the Windrush. And so even though I was born in the UK and I've lived here my whole life, I still have people come up to me and say, where are you from? And I often find with that question, it's a question that's designed to other you as a person of colour, as a Black or a brown person. And it's not asking you your geography, it's asking what kind of different are you? How can I treat you differently on the basis of where you come from? So this is kind of how I dream of responding to people who ask me where I'm from. Island Screams. Where are you from? I'm from Nottingham. No, I mean, like, where are you from? Right, I see. Well, that's easy. I'm Windrush, hybrid, island spawn. I'm sun, I'm sea, I'm rain, I'm storm, cast out, cast in. I'm hope, reborn, and lost as soon as it was formed. I'm bloody rivers, battleships. I'm ackee, saltfish, fish and chips. I'm cocoa butter on your lips. I'm soursop. I'm apple pips. I'm from the land of wooden huts and bras made out of coconuts, where ganja burns and Europe tuts from inside of their history books. I'm blue magic and hot-combed hair. I'm from the blood-stained windows where the ivory banks of Europe glare and leave my empty pockets bare. I'm from a distant echoed threat, an island that I've never met, where sun and sea and toil and sweat are called your favourite vacay yet. From Caliban and animals 2 steps away from Crusoe and his cannibals, an island of black Hannibals. You dream about your ticket to Montego Bay you found on Thompson holidays, where trees bend back and snap their roots to meet you on your merry ways. So many days of mine are spent repenting for a helpless crime. I swing upon a slowly snapping vine, and then I realize I'm sugarcane, I'm wind, I'm rain, I'm hurricanes that tear the ground. I'm ancestors that won't be found, whose bodies beat from underground. I'm redskin ghosts that haunt your dreams. I'm Nanny, sea coal, Puckamania screams that call across the sea and find their way right back to me. Does that answer your question? Thank you so much. Thank you for listening.
Okay, it's me again to say that we only have 6 minutes left. And so what I think is the best way to proceed, because I know my other co-hosts had so much to say about Ambrose and Cara's poetry, But I'm wondering if we could, I know we're all going to post things about this event on social media, and I would invite people to respond that way. I also would like to bring Laura on to speak for about, let's say, 2 or 3 minutes about the poems, and then bring Patricia on to do a closing remark. So if we could do that, that would be great. Thanks.
Okay, Debbie, yeah. So we'll start with Ambrose poems, and those are Journeying and Martians, Effing Martians. And these are incredibly strong pieces.
Okay, we just lost Laura.
Uh-oh.
Okay, Laura's back.
Okay. Did you hear any of that?
Just the part about you saying you were going to start with Ambrose's poems.
Oh, okay. So the two poems, Journeying and Martians, Effing Martians, are both very, very strong, powerful pieces. Journeying does so much in such a short, succinct piece. And it calls to mind the metaphor of we threw things that were heavy overboard is just exactly what the British government is trying to do to sink the problems of refugees who are trying to reach that country these days. And it reminded me of the poem by the famous English painter J.M.W. Turner's Slave Ship, where the slaves are thrown overboard, the dead and the dying, and you see people reaching up their hands in the water. It is a frightening thing that with refugees trying to reach by boat the country, it's terribly reminiscent. And Martians, Effing Martians, all of this talking about Martians, but is so ironic because it points up how foreign people think of people who are from other countries, other cultures, and how this is just pushed a little bit because people, the right wing these days, is very much, shall we blame Martians for everything that is wrong with this world? That is happening in a lot of countries. Shall we blame refugees and immigrants and try to keep them out? And so now I will quickly say something about Cara's poems, My Activism and Island Screams, very strong pieces, and wonderful imagery in both of these poems. There's just so much imagery that it's rich. From the beginning, my activism is as quiet as firing neurons and as loud as falling statues, and straddling a battalion of broad-shouldered women who birthed dark armies and rained fire from the mountaintops, and ending, it becomes a very personal piece that becomes a call to action very successfully, reminds you to pull against the status quo until something finally snaps. And Island Screams, again, with this one starting with this repetitive and obnoxious question that tries to pigeonhole and stereotype people, and her luxurious and gorgeous response that has, again, so much wonderful imagery. And the first line is already, I'm windrush, hybrid, island spawn, I'm sun, I'm sea, I'm rain, I'm storm. Just the strength of these lines and images and the person come through as how much more this person is than this questioner can probably imagine. And the powerful ending, the screams that call across the sea and find their way right back to me. Does that answer your question? So I'll stop there, and I know people have enjoyed all of these works. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In just the minute we have left, I encourage everyone to go out to Poets Against Racism USA's website and look at the links we have on allyship and that wonderful term Ursula used, solidarity. Thank you so much to everyone who made tonight possible, our poets, our co-sponsors, our featured speaker. I was moved and had goosebumps for the entire time. Thank you for joining us. And on behalf of all of our co-sponsors, the Watershed Journal Literary Group and Poets Against Racism USA and UK, good night.